This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Matt Phelan.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics for young readers.
And today on the Comics Alternative for Young Readers, we are very pleased to talk with Matt Phelan. Matt is the creator of Snow White, a new graphic novel. And actually, we have talked about Snow White, Gwen, on the show before. And so it's really a treat to interview Matt today.
Absolutely. And Matt's also the author of 3 other graphic novels for young readers and a number of picture books. So he talks about all those things today, which is really exciting.
It is exciting. So we're going to get to Matt in just a moment, but I wanted to let everyone know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service, DCB Service. Go to dcbs.com for all of your pre-ordering needs. You'll find lots of great deals there. And when you do, let us know what you've thought about some of the books that you've gotten from them. dcbservice.com. Please do visit them, and you will not regret going there, I promise you. So, Gwen, let's see what Matt has to say.
Absolutely.
We are very pleased to have Matt Phelan on the show today. Matt is the writer and artist, creator of Snow White, a graphic novel from Candlewick Press. Matt, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to talk to you, Matt.
Yeah,
it's our pleasure.
Good.
Well, Matt, I know Snow White is your newest book, and what can you tell the listeners who may not be familiar with it or may not have seen the book yet?
Well, it's the Snow White story, but I've taken it and set it in 1930s New York City during the Depression. So it starts out in the 20s and works into the early 30s. So it's Snow White kind of done almost like a black and white film noir thriller. That's sort of the nutshell. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there were some real challenges about, taking a book and adapting a story that's so well known. I mean, this is a classic fairy tale, one of the classic fairy tales of all time. What were some of the challenges facing you when you decided to adapt this?
Yeah, I would say the biggest challenge was I really did ask myself, like, why does the world need another version of Snow White? I mean, there's just so many versions of Snow White. So it originally started as sort of a brainstorming exercise. I connected the idea of apple peddlers and the Depression with the stepmother from Snow White. And I was just, that's kind of neat. And then it evolved. And when I really started thinking about doing it as an actual book, I had to really say, why am I doing this? What can I do to hopefully add something to this story, because the world maybe doesn't need another Snow White. So I had to sort of answer that question. That was really the biggest challenge for me, where it became not just, okay, this is this and this and this and this happens and then the apple and all that stuff. I had to think about, what does this story mean to me? What is the version of it that I want to write? And, I wanted to go deeper into what I think is in the story, but may have not been pulled out in other versions. If that makes sense.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah. I'm sort of curious about your interest in that time period. When I was growing up, I know I absolutely loved 1930s movies. And, my dad actually lived on the streets of New York City during the Depression. And
Oh, wow.
yeah, so actually, when Andy and I were doing this book for our podcast, I told him before we went on the air, this was really an emotional book for me because my dad was definitely a true victim of the Depression, and then ended up going off and fighting in World War II. So, in many ways, this was his time period, and it feels so much like the stories he told me. So maybe you could give us a little sense of how you sort of steeped yourself in this history and what things you looked towards as you were creating this world.
Yeah, well, I think similar to you, I think my introduction to the world is from the movies, and I was raised watching old movies. That was kind of always what I saw as a kid, and King Kong and Errol Flynn and all those things, and they stuck with me. As I got older, I never left that golden age of film. I still love that. That era. I think they're just the greatest films. And also, as I got older, I got an interest in the actual history of the time, of the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, and then the 1920s as well. Not only Buster Keaton and things like that, but also just, the music of the 20s and the clothing and the cars and the architecture. I just loved all of it. So kind of slipping into that time period is sort of a natural for me. I don't have a hard time kind of putting myself there. For Snow White, though, I had a couple choices. When you're going to do the Great Depression, you can go whole Art Deco, and make it look like a Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers thing. But I was more interested in the grit of it, the actual, which I thought was truer to this story, where it was the underbelly. She's wealthy, but it's really the story that the boys. That's where I'm kind of looking at the more street level. So I was looking at movies sort of like the late 20s and early 30s that had a murkier quality to them. They weren't the crisp film noir of the 40s. It was sort of like Fritz Lang's M, and Murnau's Sunrise. And they had this really kind of great grayish, foggy atmosphere to them. And that was the kind of thing I was sort of looking at. The Informer, also by John Ford, was a kind of a thing where I looked at that. Yeah. And, the shadows and the grit, that's what I was that was the New York, that was the Depression I was looking at for Snow White.
I absolutely love that era, and Gwen knows that I'm a huge film noir fan. And like you said, to me, this Snow White adaptation seems to be just a little bit before the traditional era of noir. It's yes. Almost some of those early Cagney movies and some of the ones you mentioned, M and things like that. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, and this goes back to some of your other books too. One of the many things that I appreciate about how you create your books is you allow the readers to understand so many things visually and with some text that give them a grasp of things that they might not know that much about, like the Great Depression, the Ziegfeld Follies, the stock market. Even if those ideas and concepts are completely foreign to them, you believe in your readers' intelligence to understand all of that stuff without going into a lot of explanation. What types of things go on in your head as a creator about, well, I should show them this much and I should tell them this much?
I do. Well, I do really feel like, because my audience is, I'm primarily writing for sort of the middle grade reader, although, teenagers and adults, and I'm writing, frankly, these books for myself. So, somebody who's 46 should like it. Hopefully, but I think you can get things across and establish things without stopping the action entirely and saying, this is how a ticker tape machine works. This is what this is. I really think you can establish an element or an era like the Dust Bowl without sort of, especially, the strength of working visually, being an illustrator, is there's something about pictures that connect to people, like almost like music, where you can get something across much faster, I think, than I don't want to say much faster, because beautiful prose will get you there too, but there's something about a shorthand of a drawing that can, I think, get your readers to the point where they see, okay, I see how that works, and we're moving on with the story. And I really think there is there's a line. You don't want it to be too confusing, but I think economy and precision is the whole mechanism that makes graphic novels really work for me. That's what I'm always looking for. So, you can give enough and not too much, but enough to establish the mood. And then I think your reader will go with you and go with the world that you've set up. And then maybe they'd be inspired later to look that up. Like, what was that ticker tape machine thing? Or, why did the Dust Bowl actually happen? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I was wondering too. I mean, you said you're a big fan of the movies from that era. Do you sometimes think of drawings and panels as sort of storyboards or screen caps from movies?
Well, not as stiff as that. I did go to film school. I didn't go to art school. I studied film and theater in college. So I do, in a way, these are sort of the movies. I wanted to be a film director, but I wanted to be a film director in 1945, which was a problem in 1992. So in a way, these books are sort of like the how I would have approached making a film. So I do think of it that way, but I don't think of it in terms of screen grabs or things like that. I think there is there's a creation of a flow and a rhythm, especially in sort of like the size of the panels and how you put that together, which creates movement within your page rather than this. There's the beauty of it is varying those size of the panels, and that creates the rhythm of it. But I do like to think of it, when people say I sat down and read your book in 15, 20 minutes, I'm not too terribly upset about that, although you think, well, I spent 3 years making it, but you do want it to be an uninterrupted rhythm to it, and that's one of the things. I don't want someone to stop in the middle of it and be like, well, look at that picture. I want them to just keep moving, because there is a rhythm to it, and almost like you can kind of get into like a trance dreamlike thing, like a silent movie. It does kind of move. I want it to move like that.
It's interesting. I'm looking through the comic, and one of the spreads that really influenced me in terms of what you're saying, and I remember when I was reading the comic, I stopped and I thought, wow, this guy really understands economy, is the page and the first chapter of the first spread in the chapter Snow Returns, where Snow and her stepmother are sitting in the lawyer's office. And you do this wonderful thing of taking advantage of both pages to show repeated images of the stepmother in a very, obviously, we know the story pretty well, a pretty negative attitude. But the way that you place the panels, her anger just comes across so much more clearly, because you get this concentrated set of 3 images of her and very little changes in those images, yet having them together grouped in the middle of the page, it's just stunning the way that creates that kind of emotional effect just in such an economical way.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, that is what I think when I'm making them, what really gets exciting when I'm working that stuff out, where you can start seeing how you can play with things. Like when in that scene where she, which has got to be the wordiest, there's more dialogue in that scene than anything else in the book. But there is, she'll say something and I can draw the lawyer not responding right away. Like there's a panel of him just looking at her like, and then he starts talking, and you get the idea that this guy, and the way I looked at it is this guy was Mr. White's friend, and he is not thrilled with her. So by having his dialogue, let's wait a panel, let him have a panel of like, she just said something, and he almost takes a second and then says, well, so in that kind of stuff you can put in, and that's the time, I think, when you're thinking about economy and precision, when you give yourself that moment, like sometimes you want a beat before the dialogue starts again, so yeah, that's the fun part for me, is figuring all that out.
Matt, I wanted to ask you what some of the decisions that you made when you were planning this, and I know that it took you 3 years to create, and
more or less,
it was definitely worth it. It was worth the wait. But I mean, this adaptation isn't what we might call a one-to-one correspondence to the fairy tale or a note-for-note adaptation. For instance, there's some things that you avoid, such as the fairest of them all aspect of the original story. What went into some of those decisions about what to take and what not to put into the story?
Well, I think that was the biggest thing, and I was frankly waiting for more people to kind of jump on me when that book came out, that I really did throw out the whole Ferris and the land thing, which is it's a major part of the story, but that it came organically from once I put it into that setting where I had the stepmother be an ex-Ziegfeld Follies star. And I thought to myself, well, she's probably, aging out of being a star, which of course means she's about 32, right? So she's,
Right.
and I figured as an actress, you're always surrounded by ingenues. There's always new starlets around, and if you're an actor, that's the game. That she wouldn't be shocked that, Snow White is so pretty. So I thought setting her as an actress, as an ex-star, it didn't make any sense anymore. I loved the mirror, and of course I did throw out the talking mirror, the magic mirror, but I gave her a room full of mirrors to kind of bring that in, because she's definitely vain. But it didn't seem to make any sense anymore for this story. And also, the more I thought about it, I just didn't like that, really. I don't think Snow White gets spared by the huntsman and helped by the dwarfs because she's pretty. It's like it had to be something more to it than she's just pretty, So I was very happy with getting rid of that. And then once I thought about, well, what would be the motivation? The motivation really is the idea of the money, the inheritance, which is a very, noir thing,
Yeah.
double indemnity, it's all about the money. So once those things started fitting into place, it felt right to me, that I could still have it in this sort of the fairy tale, but it felt more grounded to me and more logical in a way to get rid of that. But that was a big thing, getting rid of it. And I thought about it, I said, can I do that? Can you get rid of, the fairest in the land and get rid of the mirror? And once I just said, yeah, it was just, once you just go with it, you have to, committed to it. But it made a lot of sense to me for this story, for this story set in that time.
But it's interesting, too, because fidelity to Disney can sometimes be really problematic, actually. I appreciate that, that you moved away from that, because it does then give your variant a very fresh and new feel. And, so I actually think it's great that you did that. And there's one other thing that I thought was really interesting, too, which is your choice of young men to play the dwarf role. I mean, many of my students, when you're a professor of children's lit, you're interacting with students, many of whom only have ever seen or heard of the Disney version of folklore and fairy tales, and then you try and work them away from that a little bit to look at other possibilities. I'd love for you to comment a little bit on your on the creation of the dwarfs, quote unquote dwarfs from the story. Your decision making process for that.
Okay. Yeah. Well. First off, I'm a big fan of the Disney film. I think it's a great version of Snow White. It's interesting because that film came out in 1936, right? It came out in the Depression, where my story is set a couple years earlier, and it was a big critical success. It was the first time no one thought it could make a cartoon that would last an hour and a half and keep your thing and make you feel something. And I think it does all those things. And I think they made some interesting changes to the story that are not bad, actually. I think the ending of the actual fairy tale is a little bit, it's a little rough, and not in a way where we can't, children can't, take the real grim thing. At the end of the real story, if you read it, if people read it, is they let the stepmother lives, and they invite her to the wedding, and then when she gets to the wedding as a guest, they put her in burning hot metal shoes and make her dance in front of Snow White to her death at the wedding.
Right, I know. I teach this, so
yeah. So it's I went back to the story and I'm reading that and I'm like, that kind of makes me like Snow a little bit less. I mean, it's like, how much different is she? I mean, the poison apple seems almost, a polite way to kill somebody compared to burning shoes. So Disney tossed that out, and I thought, I like the way they did it. I actually took a version of that for my book too, the same sort of thing. And the dwarves, obviously, like you said, a lot of kids, it's their first and sometimes only exposure to the story is that Disney version. And the seven dwarfs, the personalities, we all know them. That was kind of a genius of that film. And I had the idea early on about these, my seven being these street kids, these sort of urchins, these orphans, and then taking out all the jolliness that you see in the Disney film, because these are kids living on the streets, right?
And for me, the point of doing the book, going back to that question, why do a version of Snow White, was coming up with this idea that their names are never ever given. And it's a stark contrast to sleepy, grouch, dopey, grumpy, all that kind of stuff. It's the reverse of that, where if you might read a Snow White, having seen the Disney version, you're expecting grumpy and all those kinds of people. And these kids will not tell their names. And that withholding of the names is for me, the most important thing of the story. And the scene where they finally give up their names is, for me, when I came up with that scene, I thought that's the reason to do the book, is that scene right there. But that said, I knew that my readers be reading it being like, okay, well, there's got to be some parallels. So I had fun putting in some parallels. So there's one kid that yawns, and the other kid says, he's always tired, And then the leader of the group is kind of cranky, So I wanted to have those kind of little things in there that people will be like, oh, I wonder, try to, and if you can do it, if you look at the boys in my book, you can kind of like, okay, this one's Doc and this one's that, because I was thinking about that. It was a fun way for me to bring some of that into these boys, but I wanted them to be the polar opposite. They're not hi ho. They're the opposite of Snow's privilege. They're living on the streets. They're as jaded and cynical as a 12-year-old should ever be. And that's and it's, I think, her optimism and her goodness. That's what connects to those boys, and I think that's the reason they save her, and that's the reason she's important. For me, that's the whole point of the story.
I absolutely love, Matt, what you do with the street kids, and I want to take it back to the very beginning, because in noir, a lot of noir films and stories, you've got an ordinary guy that finds himself in a world that he just doesn't belong in and has no business in, and he's trying to get out of it, and in a way you've kind of reversed that in some ways, because in the very beginning, the opening panel, we see this image of this beautiful woman, and we're not sure if she's asleep or if she's unconscious or what. And then the next scene is just a gorgeous double page spread of the guy looking into the window and seeing her, and the policeman with the NYPD, the do not cross sign. And so we see really, really quickly that this isn't a fantasy. This is a gritty reality. But later on in the book, when Samantha takes the 7 outside and she says, I'm going to show them something magical, I mean, that really, really challenges their worldview, really.
Yeah.
In a way, it's kind of an opposite of, the ordinary guy being in a place he doesn't belong. These guys are seeing something that they've never imagined before. And I just thought that was such a beautiful scene.
Yeah, and it's right there in front of them. It's there, and that was the whole point that she says, the same snow. She's talking about where she went to school and how beautiful it is out in the country, and they're like grumbling. It's like, it's not, you're in the city now. And she says the same snow falls here. It's like that's there if you find it. And that was the idea of taking them to those kids to the magic of the Macy's windows at the holiday time, and that's what they remember. That's where they put her. That's where she is at the beginning. It opens that opening where it is very crime scene, but later in the book, when you see that she brings them there to show them something beautiful, that's where they bring her. That's where they put her. That's her glass coffin. Yeah. But that opening too is that was also establishing that noir mood. It's almost the opening of Sunset Boulevard, which starts with William Holden drowned in the pool, narrating his own death, which is a great hook. But it established that, and then going how did we get here? That's sort of a nice thing to do, I think, in noir and things like that. So yeah, but it was I wanted to have that as their worldview is the streets and the the difficultiness, and she's still saying, look, there's good in this world. She's hope. That's the way I look at it. Yeah. And the boys too, another thing back to the movies, there was a series of movies in the 30s called the Dead End Kids. And that was also an inspiration for making them, the Dead End Kids, basically these Bowery kids living on the streets.
And wasn't there, I don't want to stray too far from the topic, but wasn't there a John Garfield movie that had some of the Dead End Kids in it? Yeah,
they were in a bunch of them. They started out in a real serious movie. I think it's called Dead End. Yeah, it's Dead End. And it's got Humphrey Bogart in it. I think John Garfield might be in it. I thought Bogart was in it too, in like a small role.
Yeah.
And they were sort of that's a pretty gritty film. It was a play, I think, on Broadway. I'm almost certain in the 30s, and they made a film of it. And they were so popular that the studio was like, well, let's make some more movies. And their movies became more madcap and wacky as it went on. But they did start out in a pretty gritty. I think the original Dead End is a pretty gritty film, and then they kind of became like Andy Hardy and the City. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. They made a ton of them. I think they were making them when those guys were like 35 that were still making those things,
I knew they made them for quite a while. Yeah.
Oh, I seem to remember watching them that, like on Sunday afternoons, after Abbott and Costello was on, there'd be like a Dead End Kids movie and I'd watch it and like, oh, I don't know. Yeah. But the first one's definitely in that era and of that sort of grittiness, the gritty side of the, it was interesting. They were making these films. They were also making Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, but they were making a couple of them that would have the seedy side, Like another inspiration for me for this, it was the opening 5 or 10 minutes of King Kong before they get on the boat to go to the island, where they're in the city and Denham discovers Fay Wray as she's stealing an apple.
Oh yeah,
another apple, and then takes it to like an automat, and he talks her into it, and she's cold, and she's wearing. And those opening scenes have a great atmosphere, and that was kind of another thing that stuck in my head, because you really feel how desperate she is, that she agrees to go on this boat with this guy to make a movie somewhere. It gets spoiler, it gets really bad for him, but
spoiler alert.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, I haven't seen it in a while. I definitely want to see it again. And I know.
That movie is so good. That movie is, I think it's one of the best adventure movies ever made. It's so good. It's such a good film. Yeah.
Well, I want you to keep watching old movies because what it's helping you produce is tremendous. And I wanted to ask you too. I mean, and we talked a little bit about history before, and I know from reading your other books. Storm in the Barn and Around the World and Bluffton, which focuses on Buster Keaton, which I hope to talk about too in just a minute. Many of these stories, maybe all of them, are parts of history that we might not think of, or kids might not think of when people talk about history a lot. There may not be in like the top 10 historical stories kids might hear. Do you find that kids are attracted to these eras and these subjects maybe because they don't know that much about them and they're curious?
Well, I think it's a little bit of that, and it's a little bit of, and I do love history. I'm really interested in history, but I've always been interested in, the things that aren't the big, 1066 or the big wars and all that kind of stuff, is these little things. Like take Around the World as an example. That's 3 true stories about people who circled the globe solo at the end of the 19th century. And that book started with me buying books about those 3 people just because it was interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And one of them is Thomas Stevens, the first man to ride around the world on a bicycle. And, one of those big high wheel bicycles. And I remember looking at that book in a bookstore. And one of the first things I thought to myself was, how come I've never heard of this guy? Like, this is amazing. And then I thought, well, when I was putting the book together, like what 4th or 5th grader wouldn't be interested in the first person to ride around the world on a bicycle, where he's riding in places where people had never seen a bicycle. So you can talk about the history of the bicycle and how that was important and stuff like that. So I do kind of gravitate to these sort of times, and then show the times, but also show that things haven't changed. Like Bluffton takes place in 1909, 1910, 1911, but it's really about the friendship of these 2 boys, which is the same as a friendship now, and I think that's when kids start reading Bluffton. I've talked to kids, and they really kind of, they get past the history of it and they get right to the heart of it, which is, for that book it's as much about Buster Keaton as a young vaudeville star as it is about 2 kids skipping stones, in the lake in the middle of a summer afternoon for me. So there's some taking the timeless elements of history and then just putting them in a setting where you can learn a little bit, but you can see that also it's not that different from today.
I would actually argue that's going on in Snow White. I mean, I'm going to be teaching this book next fall in my young adult or my little children literature class. And one of the things that I will be interested to see my students react to is how much that disparity between wealth and poverty that's really central to this text is central today. I mean, not that much has changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And with Snow White, I finished the art probably last December, so it was a while. But as this year has gone on, the idea that there's more good people in the world than bad people, it became, for me, I was just like, boy, this is a real. I mean, I don't want to write a message book, but if there's a message in it, that's what I honestly believe that, and I think, well, it's not a bad time to kind of get that, to have a book that sort of says that,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so like I said, there's timeless elements to this stuff, and I think if you set up the mood and the tone of the historical setting, the kids will slip into that. And then, no one's ever asked me, well, why don't they have a cell phone? You just forget all about that. Just get into it, Why doesn't Snow White just call somebody?
Well, Matt, that reminds me, I read an interview you did a few years ago with Comic Book Resources when Bluffton was published. And you mentioned that writing stories in a contemporary setting would seem, they would necessarily involve cell phones and computers. And that placing your stories in the past makes them seem almost like a fantasy story to kids today.
It really does. I think so. It's such a, it's such a different thing. I'm obviously old enough that all this stuff is still slightly newfangled to me, So, I remember you had a telephone on your wall, and if you left your house, well, there was no calling anybody till you got back, So, and these kids, they've grown up with the computer in your pocket, and so taking all that away is sort of, it's such a strange thing. It's almost like writing fantasy.
I'm laughing because anyone who listens to our Young Readers show in November and then this interview, this is the second time someone has said that we had a phone on the wall.
Yeah,
and we dialed it,
That's where it was, and that was it. You would say, okay, let's meet somewhere at 7. And if you got there and they weren't there, you wouldn't find out till the next day why they weren't there.
Yeah. And no answering machines or anything like that.
No.
Life was noir. See?
It was.
It was.
and somehow it actually just, it kept going. It worked. So, it wasn't, it was fine. Everything was fine.
Well,
I'm not a Luddite, but I just, it's sort of, we don't need it. We could be fine without it.
Hey, rotary dial representing on this podcast.
That's right. That's right. Well, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Bluffton, because that when I first picked it up, I thought, oh, great, Buster Keaton. But, you don't really focus on any of his films. It's like you said, it was during, when he was a boy and he was vacationing in Michigan. And but we learn, even if you don't, or even if readers don't know anything about Buster Keaton, they know so much about his character and about what he was all about just from reading Bluffton. And of course they can discover his films now because you can see them. They're much more accessible than they were before. But so was Keaton always have you always been a Keaton fan?
Absolutely. Yeah. Keaton's always been with me. I mean, since I was probably like 5 or 6, we had Charlie Chaplin films and Laurel and Hardy and Keaton, and I loved all of them. But we had the Cops and the General, which I think probably was all you could possibly get at that point. Mm-hmm. And it always stuck with me. I mean, even as a little kid, there was something about that unsmiling. There's something about Buster Keaton that you connect with. And I just stayed fascinated with him as I just all the way through, high school and college. At that point, it was still, they weren't on VHS or anything like that. You would have to be hard to find one. You go into like an old library and it'd be like a beat up copy of one of his movies, like, oh my God, The Navigator. And you would like, so excited that you get a chance to see this thing. So instead of that, I would just get every book I could get, again, pre-internet, I would just go in bookstores and hope they had one. Or my college library had some great Keaton biographies. So I would just read all that stuff. And it was his autobiography that I read where I learned about these, his childhood as a vaudeville star. And he says, in that book that, of everything I've done in my life, the happiest days of my life were the summers I spent in Bluffton. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. Here's this guy who was a star from age 4, and he's done all these amazing things. But when he thought back on his life, the happiest days of his life was these 3 months out of the year where he did not have to be a star. And you think about this kid who was doing professional vaudeville. He went to school one day in his life. For him, the summer in Bluffton, where he could fish and play baseball, he got to be just a kid.
Yeah.
And he wasn't really a kid the other time. He liked it, but he loved that he could just be a kid these summers. So that just stuck with me. I thought in the back of my head, I was like, I'd love to do something about Buster, but I thought maybe it would be about his films, the early days of Hollywood. But the more I thought about that, I thought that's really, I can really get to the heart of Buster by going to the time where he said was the happiest days of his life. And it has been great. The year I was working on the book, I was doing school visits. I do a lot of school visits. And there were kids who say, well, what are you working on now? And I'd say, how many kids here have heard of Buster Keaton? And like 0. No teachers, nobody.
Probably the teachers, yeah.
Yeah, teachers didn't even, and then I'd say, how many people heard Charlie Chaplin? And maybe one kid. And I thought, this is not right. These guys are, it's part of our culture, and they're amazing filmmakers. Buster, I think, is one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. And if you look at his films from as a director standpoint, I think he was the best director of the silent era, not just a comedian. If you looked at the way his films work, you look at The General and how that cuts together, and you watch it today, and it feels contemporary because it doesn't, and he doesn't have that overacting that people kind of associate with silent movies. None of that's in there, but he had an instinct about where to put the camera, which is opposed to Chaplin, who was a genius, but he would just put the camera there, and he would be like on a stage and be funny. But Keaton was one of the first people that said, well, if I cut to here, that'll make that funnier. So he was just a genius, so Buster was always something. And one of the great things for me about having written Bluffton is going to schools and things like talking to kids and having like the librarian say, before your visit, we showed them a couple of YouTube clips of Buster Keaton, and she's like, I don't know how it's going to go, but a second into it, they're all laughing because it's funny. I showed my kids a Buster Keaton movie last night. They were in hysterics because it's funny. It's funny.
Which one did you show?
I actually showed them The Navigator. That's why it was in my head, where they're adrift, and they have an 8-year-old and a 5-year-old, and they were in hysterics because it's still funny.
It's so funny you say that, because when I grew up in Flint, Michigan, and I was in a neighborhood with people who were immigrants from all around the world, and very few of them spoke English. So my mom rented Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin and Keystone Cops films, and we'd show them on the side of our garage and have people over, and it was great because, like you say, everyone can just start immediately in the same place. You get it, and you get it, and it's funny, and so it's so nice to hear your kids are having a really great experience with that too. So
it translates. And when I was researching the book, I went to Muskegon and I went to Bluffton, and it hasn't changed a whole lot since he was there. And you can see why he loved it so much. This is a wonderful little spot. It's a wonderful little neighborhood. And it was great. You can really see exactly why he loved it so much. His baseball field was still there.
Wow.
Yeah. It was in trouble being developed recently, so I'm not sure if it's still there. But it was definitely there when I was researching the book.
Yeah. Wow. That's great.
Yeah. Well, Matt, I have to tell you, like I told you before, I'm a librarian, but me and a coworker of mine are in charge of a classic movies program at the library every month.
Oh, wow. Great.
And we were looking on the list of licensed movies, and my coworker's a huge Buster Keaton fan. I'm a fan, but she's like out of this world. and there were like no Buster Keaton movies that were licensed to legally show. So I contacted the guy at the licensing department, and I said, look, I know it's going to cost us some money, but we'd really like to show The General at the library. How much is it going to cost? And he says, let me get back to you. So he calls me back and he says, oddly enough, The General has fallen into the public domain, so you can show it for free.
Get out of town, really?
We are so excited. Yeah, we're going to show The General at the library, and I hope we have a packed house. We're so stoked about this.
Yeah, I'm all for, when my book came out, there was a store in Alexandria, Virginia, Hooray for Books, and they did an event with me where there's like a movie theater in Alexandria, like an old movie theater, really old one, and they showed The General, and they had a guy playing live organ, and I introduced the film.
Oh wow!
And, it was the best, and it was just like, and everyone, it's a great film. So the more people who can see The General, the better. It's it's always on the AFI list of best 100 best movies. Always hovers around 15 or 19 or something. It's a great film.
Well, hey, maybe you'd like to come introduce our movie.
Sure.
We're in Maryland. I don't think that's too terribly far from.
That's not far. Yeah, that's not far.
Yeah. Road trip.
I'm actually doing an event in Bellingham, Washington in March, and they're kind of working on doing I'm going to be at a conference, but they're going to try to work out something similar where they show a Keaton film, and I'll talk about Bluffton there. Bluffton. If you're a Buster Keaton fan, you're always a Buster Keaton fan. Like that. Yeah. That book doesn't end for me. I will always talk to Buster. I went to the Buster Keaton. They have a club called the Damfinos, with the International Buster Keaton Society, and every year they have a conference in Bluffton in Muskegon, Michigan. And I went when the book came out and presented, because the guy, one of the guys who is a big part of the organization, Ron Pesch, was a local historian that I contacted when I was researching the book, and he gave me a walking tour of Bluffton. He knows everything about all this stuff. So I went for the thing, and Buster's granddaughter and daughter-in-law and nephew were there, and I was very nervous because we were there for a few days. So they got the book, and of course the book only takes half hour to read, maybe. So they got the book on Friday, and I presented my thing, and by Saturday they came up to me and they told me they thought Buster would have loved it, which is just great. The greatest thing I'd ever heard. I was just like, oh, it's great.
That's tremendous.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I'm just going to ask a quick comics question.
All right.
I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. This has been
somewhere about Buster Keaton. Yeah.
Well, no, but this has been really interesting because we're thinking about the move from black and white into color, et cetera. And when I was reading, Snow White, one of the things that was really interesting to me was your use of color. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I wanted the look of Snow White to be very much like that sort of murky black and white that you see in films like M and The Informer and stuff like that. But I also always liked to sort of in silent films where they would hand tint the films. So like a night scene might be a blue tint. So I thought, well, that's interesting. So let's, I could play with that where, there would be a scene that's sort of in a green tint or a blue tint and play with that. But also, I did the same sort of thing in The Storm in the Barn, which was set in the Dust Bowl. And it was all very dusty browns.
Right.
And I held back, similar to Snow White, I held back the color red, and the Storm in the Barn first comes out as blood, and then it comes out as violence. Basically, I use the color. But if you restrict your palette, then you can use certain colors as a tool, as a weapon. It becomes really pops out. If I have red throughout the book, when I first introduce red, it's not a big deal. But if you wait till you see that red apple, it's going to really pop out of that. So I like using color in that way where you're thinking about it as a really another part of your toolbox rather than saying, okay, well, I guess this needs to be, what's the contrast of blue, orange? Yeah, okay, I'm gonna put that in there. So you want to restricting it makes it more powerful when you do use it. There was a scene in the Dust Bowl in the Storm in the Barn where it's all very dusty, and there's only one sequence that's sort of full color, and it's when the boy's mother is talking about how things were before the Dust Bowl happened.
Right.
And by painting that, it gave you that feeling of, what these people had lost. But if I'd done the whole book in full color, I couldn't have done that. So right. I'm interested in that. And Snow White was the same sort of thing.
I'm up on campus, and I thought for a minute that the entire marching band was going to start playing outside my window. So if I disappeared for a minute, it was like, oh my God. But no, they're actually disbanding, so it's okay.
That happens. Yeah.
A marching band just shows up whenever you're trying to do anything, I swear.
They never play quietly.
No,
they do not.
No, never. Just turn it down, marching band. Come on.
Well, Matt, I don't know how much you can tell us about projects that you're working on now. Can you tell us anything about what's coming up?
I can tell a little bit. I just sold my next book I'm a picture book artist as well. So I always, go back and forth between these graphic novels, and I do picture books for younger readers. And I always follow up the graphic novels with picture books because it just feels like a relief after spending, of doing that marathon, which is what a graphic novel is. Mm. So this year I've been just doing picture books. My next book actually that I've written is actually going to be a picture book coming out a year from now, maybe next year, the year after that, about pigs on a picnic. It's called Picnic.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah. So it's the polar opposite of Snow White, but in a way, it's in a funny way. When I thought about it, I was like, in a way, it's actually the same sort of idea that everything's going to be fine, but it's just done for somebody who's maybe a year or 2 years old. But my next book that's for the same audience as Snow White, I just sold. So I probably can't tell too much about it, but I will say that it's more of a hybrid chapter book. I'm interested now in playing with the form. I've done 4 graphic novels, and I'm kind of interested in expanding a little bit and saying, what can we do with storytelling in a book where, there's prose and there's maybe panels and there's maybe full bleed, which is something I did with Snow White. I brought in what I thought consciously. I was thinking of bringing in a lot of things that I do for my picture book work into Snow White, where you have like that spread where you open up and there's the detective looking at the, of Snow White in the window. That's a full page bleed, which you don't see a whole lot in comics, but is perfectly what we, done in picture books all the time. So I liked the idea of playing with the form, and I'm interested in just experimenting a little bit more, when Brian Selznick came out with the invention of Hugo Cabret, me and every other illustrator in the world was like, whoa, this guy, dude.
Yeah.
You got that for a couple more times, and it's open source. Everyone's got to be able to do it. So, but I'm not going to steal that idea for him. But I really liked how that when that book came out, it was like, wow, this guy's done something really different. So I'm interested in playing with the form. So the next book, I don't think I will say it's probably not going to be a straight graphic novel, and it's going to be a hybrid of different forms, and I'm very excited. And because of that, I'm really excited to work on it. It's also kind of a departure for me that it's sort of like an adventure comedy. I haven't done a whole lot of funny in the last 4 books, and which a lot of my friends are like, oh, you're kind of a funny guy, but your books are so sad. And I thought, well, yeah, but I like to sort of explore that, You want to just I don't want to keep doing the same thing. Someone asked me, you're going to do another fairy tale. And I thought, well, I'm not really, it doesn't seem to me like following Snow White with a Cinderella or Rumpelstiltskin would be the way to go. So I'm interested in trying something different.
Sounds exciting.
Well, Matt, you mentioned studying film. Do you ever have any desire to work in film?
No, when I got out of college, I did some screenwriting, and I actually had an original script optioned. It was very exciting, and I quit my day job, and I got an agent in Hollywood, and I did all these rewrites for the producer. And like most screenplays, it eventually went nowhere. They couldn't get a director attached to it, and it was kind of be an expensive sort of film, so it just died, like most films do. And I had an agent, and she said, well, why don't you come out to LA and I can get you some meetings, and maybe you can be like the 4th rewrite guy on Flintstones 5 or something. I don't know. And I just didn't want to live that life where you can live as a screenwriter and have a perfectly successful life and yet never see anything you've actually written ever up on the screen. And I just thought that does not appeal to me. And at the same time, I was discovering picture books, and I thought, this is what I want to do, So, no, the Store in the Barn was optioned at one point, and the option lapsed, and I was, I got on the phone. It was one of the producers from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I was really excited. I thought, wow, this is going to be really cool. But having already gone through the Hollywood mill a little bit, I was very cautious. I was just like, well, this is probably not going to happen. Funny thing is, it didn't happen. But at the same time, there was a theater in Portland, Oregon that also contacted me and wanted to do a stage production of Store in the Barn. And I said, wow, yeah, that sounds great. And a year later, I was sitting in that theater watching that stage production.
Wow.
The movie people were like, oh, we're going to make this. And I was like, the theater people are like, yeah, we want to do this. And they did it. And it was amazing. Oh,
that is awesome.
Yeah. It's the Oregon Children's Theater. They do great work. And not only they did it as a sort of a very stylized production, but they hired musicians to write music for it. It wasn't a musical, but they had music throughout. And the musicians were basically the Decemberists, the band The Decemberists.
Oh, wow, cool.
Oh, get out of here. Wow.
Yeah, so it was all the guys except Colin Malloy. They had this other band called Black Prairie, like all the other musicians, and then two other a guitarist and a vocalist, violinist, Annalisa Tornfeld, really amazing. So this band Black Prairie, and they wrote original music for The Story in the Barn, and it was just an amazing. The show was great. I couldn't have been happier. That's probably one of the high points of my career, sitting there watching other artists take what I've done and create music and theater out of that. It was fantastic. So I didn't really care about the movie anymore. I was just like, you know.
Forget you, Hollywood. I've got my stage production.
Well, by the time the movie, there'd be like a wacky sidekick by the time the movie started. They would have changed everything. So
yeah. Oh man. Well, that must have been tremendous.
Oh, it was wonderful. Yeah, really wonderful. And you can still get the soundtrack from the Black Prairie soundtrack. The actors did the music, but Black Prairie recorded like the version of the soundtrack that you can buy from them. And I told them I wish I had the music when I was writing the book because it's just perfect. It's amazing. Yeah.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been a real pleasure talking about Snow White, Buster Keaton, and everything else. And we certainly wish you the best with continued success with Snow White and all the other projects that you have coming up.
Well, thank you very much. It was wonderful talking with you guys, and I think we probably could talk for a couple more hours. But
this was so great, Matt.
It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Well, Gwen, it was just a real pleasure talking with Matt about Snow White, about Buster Keaton, about just about everything. It was
and the
so
marching band walked away and didn't play outside the window.
Right.
All in all, it was a good afternoon.
It really was. It was a lot of fun.
I do have to say the Western Michigan University Broncos marching band is awesome. It's just that we didn't want to book them for this particular event.
Well, and we want to thank Matt once again for talking with us and taking up part of his day. And I know he's got his family there. But Matt, thank you again so much. And again, we want to let everyone know that DCB Service is our sponsor. And after you get some books with them, you can get in touch with us and let us know what you think of those books. You can contact us by going to the website at comicsalternative.com. And on the right-hand side of your browser, you will see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. You can click on that, and from the comfort of your own laptop or mobile device, you can send us a message. You can send us a message through SpeakPipe, or if you want to contact us by phone, you can call us at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-3266427. Or
bonus points if you call from the phone on the wall.
That's right. The
rotary
phone
dial
on the wall.
That's right.
Or if you want to contact us by email, we are the number 2 guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can we reach you?
Folks can reach me at Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And, you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcast and updates to our blog. And there we are at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. And you can find us also on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest. We have a YouTube channel, so you can hit us up that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, and you can discover all of our episodes, as well as our reviews and our comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com. And you can get us
where
on
else?
Spotify.
Yes.
I remembered for once. So, thank you all again for listening, and let us know what you think. Until next time, I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen. See you soon.
Bye-bye.